John Locke's philosophy begins with the conviction that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which experience inscribes all knowledge. There are no innate ideas, no eternal truths imprinted by nature, no pre-existing forms hovering in the soul. Everything we know comes through sensation and reflection, through the slow accumulation of impressions and the rational interpretation of them. The mind receives the raw material of perception from the external world, and through reflection, organizes it into coherent understanding. Thus, knowledge is not a divine inheritance, but a human construction, born of labor, observation, and discipline. Locke's empiricism becomes both a method of inquiry and a philosophy of human humility, reminding us that certainty is rare and that even our most confident beliefs are built on the shifting sands of experience. From this foundation, Locke draws a new conception of identity. The self, he argues, is not a fixed essence or metaphysical substance. It is the continuity of consciousness, the ongoing awareness that links our past, present, and future experiences. You are yourself not because of your body, nor because of some immortal soul, but because you remember being you. Memory, not matter, anchors identity. Yet this insight also introduces a fragility to the human condition. If memory falters, identity unravels. The person who forgets their past is, in a deep sense, not the same self that once acted, suffered, or loved. Locke's notion of personal identity thus becomes one of the first modern recognitions that human existence is psychological, temporal, and contingent, rather than eternal and immutable. In knowledge, Locke distinguishes between degrees of certainty. There is intuitive knowledge, where the mind perceives immediate agreement or disagreement between ideas, as in the recognition that white is not black. There is demonstrative knowledge, where we link ideas through intermediate steps, as in mathematics. And there is sensitive knowledge, which arises from our perception of external objects, the weakest form, since it depends on the reliability of our senses. The vast majority of our opinions, Locke warns, falls short of knowledge. They are matters of probability, not certainty. This acknowledgement of human limitation becomes the cornerstone of his liberal philosophy. Since no person possesses infallible truth, no one should impose their beliefs by force upon others. From epistemology, Locke proceeds naturally to politics. His two treatises of government stand as a direct refutation of the divine right of kings and as a rational defense of individual liberty. Human beings, he argues, are by nature free and equal. Before the formation of government, they live in a state of nature governed by reason and the law of nature, the obligation to preserve oneself and others, to respect life, liberty, and property. Property itself arises from labor. When a person mixes their labor with the resources of the earth, they make them their own. The field you till, the fruit you harvest, the home you build, all become extensions of your person. This is Locke's moral foundation for economic rights, and it will become one of the most influential ideas in modern thought, shaping both liberal democracies and capitalist economies. Yet the right to property is not absolute. It is bounded by the principle of sufficiency, that one must leave enough and as good for others. This condition, though often forgotten by his later interpreters, reveals Locke's sense of moral balance. Freedom for him is not the license to take without limit, but the right to enjoy the fruits of one's labor without depriving others of the same opportunity. Government enters the picture only when individuals consent to form a political society, transferring some of their natural freedom to a common authority for the sake of protection and justice. This consent is the true source of legitimate power. Kings and parliaments rule not by divine mandate, but by the trust of the governed. And when that trust is broken, when government becomes destructive of the ends it was created to serve, the people have the right, even the duty, to resist and to establish a new one. Locke's theory of government thus becomes both revolutionary and conservative. It justifies rebellion against tyranny, but it also seeks stability through law. The social contract is not a call to perpetual revolution, but a rational agreement for the preservation of rights. In this way, Locke provides the intellectual architecture of constitutionalism: power limited by consent, authority checked by representation, and law grounded in natural rights rather than arbitrary will. The influence of these ideas extends from the Glorious Revolution in England to the American and French revolutions that followed, embedding Locke's vision in the modern democratic imagination.
Beneath Locke's political philosophy lies a profound moral anthropology. Human beings, he insists, are not born corrupt or virtuous. They are born capable. Education, experience, and environment determine their moral and intellectual development. This belief animates his Some Thoughts Concerning Education, where he rejects harsh discipline and rote learning in favor of reason, example, and self-control. Virtue, for Locke, is not the suppression of desire, but the rational governance of it. The goal of education is to produce individuals who can think for themselves and act with moderation, citizens capable of liberty. In this sense, Locke's political and educational philosophies are inseparable. The free society depends on the rational individual, and the rational individual is the product of enlightened education. Locke's theological views, though moderate, are essential to his philosophy. He is no atheist. His belief in God grounds his conception of natural law. Yet he resists dogmatism and insists on the limits of human understanding in divine matters. In The Reasonableness of Christianity, he argues that the core of religion lies not in metaphysical speculation or ecclesiastical authority, but in moral practice and faith in Christ's message of salvation. Religion, like government, must rest on consent and persuasion, not coercion. Tolerance, therefore, is both a political necessity and a religious duty. The care of souls, Locke writes, is not committed to the magistrate. This assertion, radical in its time, lays the foundation for the modern principle of the separation of church and state. Locke's empiricism, extending from knowledge to politics and morality, forms a unified vision of human nature as rational, adaptable, and self-governing. It is a philosophy of moderation, neither authoritarian nor anarchic, neither skeptical to the point of despair, nor credulous to the point of fanaticism. Its strength lies in its balance: reason guided by experience, freedom tempered by law, faith refined by tolerance. Yet beneath this balance lies a quiet tension. The same empiricism that liberates the mind from superstition also opens the door to materialism. The same individualism that defends rights also risks isolating persons in self-interest. Locke's legacy, therefore, is not a static doctrine, but a living debate, the continuing struggle to reconcile liberty with order, property with equality, reason with belief. In every domain, Locke's thought reveals an unshakable confidence in the human capacity for improvement. If knowledge begins with experience, then ignorance can be overcome by education. If government is a contract, then tyranny can be resisted by reason and courage. If virtue is learned, then morality can be cultivated. This optimism defines the spirit of modern liberalism, the belief that progress is possible through rational reform rather than divine intervention or violent upheaval. Locke's world is one where truth is not handed down from heaven, but built up from the ground, one observation, one experiment, one argument at a time. His influence endures not because he offered final answers, but because he taught us how to ask questions, patiently, empirically, and with humility. To think like Locke is to recognize that freedom and knowledge are inseparable, that the mind's independence is the foundation of all other rights. The blank slate, in the end, is not a void, but a promise that the story of human reason is still being written. Locke's theory of perception deepens his empiricist view of the mind. He distinguishes between what he calls primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are those inherent in objects themselves: solidity, extension, figure, motion, and number. Qualities that exist whether or not we perceive them. Secondary qualities, by contrast, such as color, taste, smell, and sound, exist only in relation to our senses. They are not features of the objects, but of our perception of them. The apple is not inherently red. Redness is the effect the apple's surface has on our eyes and brain. This distinction reveals Locke's early awareness of what modern philosophy would later call the subjectivity of experience. The world we know is not the world as it is in itself, but as it appears to us through the mediating structures of our perception. This insight raises a profound problem. If all knowledge comes from experience, and experience gives us only appearances, how can we know that our ideas correspond to reality? Locke's answer is cautious, but confident. He argues that while we cannot perceive the essence of things, we can have sufficient knowledge for practical purposes. The regularity and consistency of our experiences justify our belief that there is a stable external world. In other words, we live not by absolute certainty, but by reasonable assurance. This practical realism anchors Locke's empiricism and prevents it from collapsing into skepticism. His concern is not metaphysical perfection, but human functionality, a pattern that will define the modern scientific spirit.
Locke's rejection of innate ideas also reshapes the way he conceives of morality. If moral principles are not pre-inscribed in the human soul, they must be derived from reason and experience. For Locke, moral law is accessible to all rational beings because it is part of the natural order created by God. To act morally is to act according to reason, and reason reveals that every person, as a creation of God, has equal rights to life, liberty, and property. This natural law is universal, preceding any human legislation or political institution. It binds kings and subjects alike. The genius of Locke's moral philosophy lies in its universality. It offers a foundation for ethics that transcends the boundaries of nation, religion, or class. The political implications of this idea are revolutionary. Locke lived through an era of monarchical absolutism, religious conflict, and civil war. Against the claim that kings ruled by divine right, Locke asserts that political authority originates from the consent of the governed. Power without consent is illegitimate, and subjects are bound to obey the law only so long as the law protects their natural rights. The sovereign's duty is not to command, but to preserve, not to dominate, but to safeguard the conditions of human flourishing. When a ruler becomes a tyrant, violating the very trust on which his power rests, the people regain their original liberty and may establish a new government. Thus, rebellion is not an act of chaos, but a restoration of moral order. Locke's argument for limited government is not merely theoretical. It is grounded in his understanding of human psychology. Because individuals are motivated by both reason and passion, political institutions must be designed to align private interest with public good. This insight anticipates the later thought of Montesquieu and the framers of modern constitutions. For Locke, law is not an instrument of coercion, but a rational framework that makes freedom possible. The rule of law is the condition under which liberty can exist, because it replaces arbitrary will with predictable justice. In this way, Locke bridges the ancient concern for virtue with the modern demand for rights. His reflections on property form the cornerstone of liberal economics. Labor, Locke argues, is the means by which value is created. The earth and its fruits belong to all in common. But when a person mixes their labor with what nature provides, they make it their own. This principle legitimizes private ownership, but only within limits. One may appropriate only as much as one can use, and one must leave enough for others. The introduction of money, however, complicates this natural equality. Since money does not spoil, it allows for unlimited accumulation. Locke acknowledges this, but accepts it as part of social evolution. The consent to use money, he claims, is an implicit agreement to inequality. Here lies the paradox of Locke's thought. His philosophy of equality gives birth to an economic system that tolerates and even justifies inequality. In education, Locke envisions the practical application of his psychological and moral insights. The child, like the mind itself, begins as a blank slate, shaped by habit and example rather than innate disposition. Harsh punishment breeds servility, not virtue. True education cultivates reason, self-discipline, and curiosity. The aim is not to fill the mind with facts, but to teach it to think. Locke's educational philosophy anticipates modern pedagogical theories that emphasize experience, reflection, and autonomy. He understands that a free society requires not only laws, but citizens capable of self-government, and that such citizens must be trained from youth to reason, to question, and to act with integrity. Locke's approach to religion reflects the same moderate rationalism. In a time of sectarian strife, he advocates for toleration. Faith, he argues, must be voluntary. Coercion produces hypocrisy, not belief. Civil authority has no competence in spiritual matters, because salvation concerns the inner conviction of the soul. By separating church and state, Locke not only defends individual conscience, but also protects religion from political corruption. Yet he does not reject religion itself. On the contrary, he sees reason and faith as complementary. Reason establishes the moral law, and faith perfects it. God's revelation cannot contradict reason because both come from the same source of truth. Locke's essay concerning human understanding transforms philosophy by redefining its method and purpose. Instead of seeking metaphysical certainties, philosophy becomes an inquiry into the limits of human understanding. Locke compares the mind to a dark room illuminated by a few shafts of light, the light of experience and reflection. We can know much about what those rays reveal, but beyond them lies darkness we cannot penetrate. The task of philosophy is to map the boundaries of knowledge, not to claim omniscience. This humility is not defeat, but liberation. By acknowledging what we cannot know, we can focus on what we can improve. In this sense, Locke's empiricism becomes the intellectual foundation for modern science, democracy, and education alike.
Locke's influence on later thinkers is immense. Berkeley will refine his empiricism into idealism, arguing that to be is to be perceived. Hume will radicalize it into skepticism, questioning whether we can ever justify belief in causation or the self. Rousseau will transform Locke's social contract into a vision of collective will. Jefferson will embed Locke's words almost verbatim into the Declaration of Independence. Yet what unites these divergent heirs is the recognition that Locke opened the path from authority to autonomy, from revelation to reason, from obedience to freedom. At the heart of Locke's thought lies a vision of progress rooted in moral and intellectual self-determination. Human beings are not fixed creatures. They are learners, capable of reforming their minds, their societies, and their governments. This faith in improvement underpins the Enlightenment ideal, that knowledge, when freed from dogma and directed by virtue, can transform the human condition. Locke's world is one in which tyranny can be resisted by reason, ignorance dispelled by education, and division healed by tolerance. Yet there is also a quiet warning within his optimism. The blank slate can be written upon by truth or falsehood, by virtue or corruption. Education, politics, and culture all shape the mind's inscriptions. Thus, liberty is not a gift once won, but a constant task. It demands vigilance, reflection, and the courage to renew one's consent. Locke's philosophy, in its deepest sense, is not about what we know or possess, but about how we live, with reason as our guide and conscience as our judge. Locke's legacy within Enlightenment thought cannot be overstated. His empiricism laid the groundwork for an intellectual revolution that shifted the axis of authority from revelation to reason, from monarchy to individual judgment. By insisting that knowledge arises from experience rather than innate ideas, Locke undermined the foundations of dogmatic systems, theological, political, and philosophical alike. What he proposed was not merely a new theory of the mind, but a new method of freedom. Every human being, by the very structure of their understanding, is equipped to reason, to observe, and to doubt. In this quiet revolution, Locke transformed epistemology into a moral act. To think for oneself became the highest duty. The Enlightenment thinkers who followed, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, Jefferson, and Kant, found in Locke's writings a language of rational dignity. His notion of natural rights became the moral grammar of the age. The triad of life, liberty, and property reappeared across constitutions and declarations, shaping the political vocabulary of modernity. Yet beyond politics, Locke's empiricism carried deeper philosophical consequences. It introduced a new humility to knowledge and a new confidence to human reason, binding skepticism and faith in a delicate balance. In an essay concerning human understanding, Locke dismantles the metaphysical edifices inherited from scholasticism. The idea that knowledge mirrors the essence of things, that we can grasp the inner reality of substance, is, for Locke, an illusion. We know only appearances, the patterns of experience that our minds construct. Substance, whether material or spiritual, remains a mystery. We perceive the qualities of things, but not the thing itself. This admission of ignorance becomes paradoxically a form of wisdom. By recognizing the limits of the intellect, Locke frees philosophy from the pretense of omniscience and redirects it toward practical understanding. This practical turn marks a decisive moment in the history of thought. For Locke, philosophy is not an escape into abstraction, but an instrument for human improvement. Theories are valuable only insofar as they illuminate the conditions of experience, morality, and governance. Knowledge should serve life, not transcend it. In this sense, Locke's empiricism anticipates the pragmatism of later centuries, where truth is measured by utility and coherence rather than metaphysical certainty. Yet Locke avoids the cynicism of pure relativism. The order of nature and the law of reason remain objective, even if our grasp of them is partial. Between dogma and nihilism, he carves out a space for rational faith, belief proportioned to evidence, conviction guided by inquiry. The tension between empiricism and idealism emerges naturally from Locke's philosophy. By emphasizing experience, Locke affirms the independence of the external world. Yet by locating all knowledge within perception, he places the mind at the center of reality. This dual commitment leads to a subtle paradox. We know the world only as it appears to us, yet we believe it exists beyond our ideas. Later philosophers will struggle with this inheritance. Berkeley will eliminate the external world altogether, claiming that objects exist only as perceptions sustained by the divine mind. Hume will radicalize Locke's framework of its theological support, leaving a universe of fleeting impressions with no guarantee of causality or selfhood. Kant, seeking to resolve this crisis, will reinterpret Locke's empiricism through the lens of transcendental idealism, arguing that the mind actively shapes experience according to its own categories. Thus, the entire modern debate between realism and idealism begins with Locke's modest but revolutionary claim that all ideas come from experience.
Locke's political thought, meanwhile, evolves alongside his epistemology. Just as the mind is shaped by experience, political authority is shaped by consent. There are no innate rulers, no natural subjects. Society is an artifact of choice, a deliberate arrangement among equals for mutual benefit. The same logic that denies innate ideas denies innate hierarchies. If all knowledge is acquired, then wisdom and virtue are not the birthright of the few, but the potential of all. Locke's politics, therefore, rests on a profound moral equality. Each person, as a rational being, has the capacity to govern themselves, and, by extension, to participate in governing others. This moral equality grounds Locke's theory of legitimate government. The social contract, for him, is not a surrender of freedom, but a rational preservation of it. In the state of nature, individuals possess liberty but lack security. By forming a government, they gain protection for their rights without forfeiting their moral autonomy. Power remains a trust, not a property. The moment it becomes arbitrary, it ceases to be legitimate. The right of revolution is thus not a disruption of order, but a restoration of justice. Tyranny, whether in the form of monarchy or democracy, is a breach of the contract, an act of moral theft. Locke's emphasis on property as a natural right has often been misread as mere economic liberalism. In truth, it arises from a deeper moral intuition that a person's labor is an extension of their being. To deny someone the fruits of their labor is to deny their humanity. Property, in Locke's philosophy, is a form of self-expression. It embodies the union of freedom and responsibility. Yet, Locke is not blind to the potential for abuse. He warns that accumulation must be tempered by reason and fairness. The consent to use money implies acceptance of inequality, but not of exploitation. The moral fabric of society depends on mutual respect, the recognition that each person's rights are bounded by the rights of others. Locke's toleration is another of his great legacies. In A Letter Concerning Toleration, he declares that faith cannot be compelled and that civil power should not intrude into matters of conscience. The magistrate's role is to secure civil peace, not to dictate salvation. Religion, to be genuine, must be free. This idea, radical in the 17th century, becomes the cornerstone of modern pluralism. Yet, Locke's toleration has limits. He excludes atheists, whom he believes cannot be trusted to keep oaths, and Catholics, whose allegiance to foreign authority he doubts. Still, the principle he articulates, that belief must be voluntary, transcends his own inconsistencies. It is the seed from which the modern concept of freedom of conscience grows. Locke's moral psychology provides the inner dimension of his political philosophy. Human beings, he observes, are guided by pleasure and pain, but capable of subordinating immediate desires to long-term happiness through the exercise of reason. Freedom, therefore, is not the absence of restraint, but the capacity to act according to rational choice. A person enslaved to passion is no more free than one enslaved by law. True liberty lies in self-governance, the ability to direct one's actions by understanding rather than impulse. This conception of freedom bridges the gap between individual ethics and civic virtue. A society of free people, for Locke, is one composed of rational, disciplined, and educated minds. His faith in education flows from this belief. He envisions moral and intellectual development as a process of habit and reflection. Character is formed not by innate tendencies, but by repeated actions guided by example. The child learns virtue as the mind learns truth through experience, correction, and reasoned understanding. The aim of education is not to create scholars, but citizens, capable of exercising judgment and responsibility. In this sense, Locke anticipates the Enlightenment's greatest hope, that ignorance and tyranny can be overcome through knowledge and rational culture. His theology, too, reflects this rational spirit. Locke accepts the existence of God as a rational necessity, the ultimate cause of being and order. But he rejects the authority of tradition or mystery as grounds for faith. Revelation must be weighed by reason. Miracles must be credible to the understanding. In The Reasonableness of Christianity, he presents religion as a simple and moral faith centered on Christ's teaching of love and repentance. Salvation is not the privilege of the few, but the possibility of all who act with sincerity. Here again, Locke's philosophy becomes an ethic of moderation, a middle path between skepticism and fanaticism, between indifference and zeal. Locke's philosophy culminates in a vision of human dignity rooted in reason. To be human is to be capable of thought, choice, and self-reflection. The blank slate, far from a sign of emptiness, is the symbol of potential. Every person, regardless of birth or creed, can write the story of their own understanding. This is the democratic promise at the heart of Locke's philosophy, that the authority of truth and the authority of power both depend on the consent of the rational mind. In this sense, Locke's empiricism is not only a theory of knowledge, but a moral revolution. It replaces obedience with inquiry, tradition with evidence, hierarchy with equality.
Locke's impact on the Enlightenment extends beyond his immediate followers. It reshapes the intellectual architecture of modern civilization. By grounding knowledge in experience and political legitimacy in consent, he introduces a new logic of justification. Authority, whether of king or priest, must now answer to reason. The old order of inherited truths gives way to the modern order of rational critique. This transformation is not sudden, but seismic, shifting the foundations of philosophy, science, and politics alike. In Locke's wake, to claim authority without evidence becomes intellectually indefensible. The mind, once subject to revelation, becomes sovereign over its own judgments. This sovereignty of the mind becomes the moral foundation of modern liberalism. For Locke, freedom is not a privilege granted by power, but a natural condition of rational beings. Every person, as a creature of reason, possesses the right to govern their own life. The state exists only to protect this autonomy, never to replace it. In his schema, law and liberty are not opposites, but partners. Law secures liberty by preventing the tyranny of both rulers and mobs. The essence of the social contract is balance between authority and consent, security and freedom, individual and community. Locke's brilliance lies in showing that such balance is not a fragile compromise, but a rational necessity. Locke's empiricism, however, carries within it an unspoken tension. If knowledge comes only through experience, and if experience is mediated by perception, then all human understanding is limited to the domain of appearances. How then can Locke justify his confidence in natural law, divine order, or the reality of external objects? This is the question that will haunt his successors. Hume will take Locke's premises to their logical extreme, arguing that our belief in causation, identity, and morality is mere habit, not reason. Kant will later attempt to rescue Locke's empiricism by reinterpreting experience as structured by the mind itself. But Locke himself remains steadfast in his balance between skepticism and belief. He admits the limits of human understanding, yet insists on the reliability of ordinary experience. We may not know ultimate reality, but we know enough to live, act, and govern justly. This pragmatic confidence defines Locke's spirit. He does not seek metaphysical certainty, he seeks workable truth. Philosophy for him is not a temple of absolute knowledge, but a workshop of practical understanding. His empiricism is an ethics of modesty. To know one's limits is to become wise. To claim more than one knows is to invite error and tyranny. In this sense, Locke's philosophy becomes a moral stance as much as an intellectual one. It trains the mind to doubt dogma, to test experience, and to judge with fairness. His ideal thinker is not the mystic or the fanatic, but the careful observer, disciplined, honest, and free. In his reflections on government, Locke develops one of the most enduring visions of constitutional order. The separation of powers, later elaborated by Montesquieu, is implicit in Locke's insistence that legislative and executive authority must remain distinct. The legislature represents the will of the community. The executive enforces it. When these powers merge, tyranny arises. By dividing authority, Locke seeks to ensure accountability and preserve the rule of law. Representation, too, becomes essential. Since power originates in consent, governance must remain responsive to the governed. The people do not surrender their sovereignty, they delegate it. The right of revolution remains as the ultimate safeguard, the final assertion that legitimacy depends on justice, not force. Locke's conception of property, though not often interpreted narrowly, contains a profound moral logic. Property, in his philosophy, is not mere possession, but participation in creation. When a person labors, they join nature and reason, transforming the raw world into a human world. This act of labor is both material and spiritual. It expresses individuality and responsibility. Yet Locke insists on a moral boundary. Appropriation is justified only when it does not harm others. The moral economy of Locke's thought thus precedes the material economy of capitalism. It envisions a society of free producers, not exploiters, a balance of self-interest and mutual obligation. Locke's theory of money reveals his realism about social evolution. The invention of money, he argues, allows for unequal accumulation, but rests on collective consent. People agree to value a neutral medium of exchange, thereby enabling trade and wealth. This innovation introduces both progress and peril. Progress through economic expansion, peril through inequality. Locke accepts this tension as an inevitable consequence of civilization, yet he never abandons his moral compass. The right to property does not erase the duty of fairness. Wealth without justice, he implies, corrodes freedom itself.
Locke's moral psychology deepens his analysis of freedom. True liberty is not doing whatever one wishes, but acting according to reasoned desire. The ungoverned appetite is a form of slavery. The rational will is genuine autonomy. This insight unites his ethics with his politics. Just as the free individual must govern their passions by reason, so the free society must govern its power by law. In both cases, freedom depends on discipline. This harmony between inner and outer order is the heart of Locke's vision. His ideal citizen is not the rebel without cause, but the rational actor, capable of both independence and restraint. Locke's educational philosophy gives practical shape to these principles. He urges that children be raised with firmness and affection, guided by example rather than fear. The goal is not to produce obedient subjects, but thoughtful persons. Curiosity, he insists, is the engine of learning. By cultivating it, educators nurture both intellect and character. The mind must be exercised as the body is, through effort, habit, and reflection. Knowledge without virtue is dangerous. Virtue without understanding is blind. The task of education is to unite the two. A well-formed mind, Locke believes, is the foundation of both personal happiness and civic health. Locke's religious views, though moderate, were revolutionary in their implications. He sees reason and faith as allies rather than enemies. Revelation, to be authentic, must not contradict reason. Religion, therefore, becomes a moral enterprise rather than a system of mysteries. In The Reasonableness of Christianity, Locke presents faith as the rational acceptance of divine morality, a creed accessible to all regardless of intellect or status. Christianity, stripped of dogmatic excess, is for him a simple command to love God and neighbor. His call for toleration arises from this simplicity. If religion's essence lies in moral sincerity, coercion becomes not only futile but sacrilegious. The soul must be free because truth cannot be forced. Locke's separation of church and state establishes one of the cornerstones of modern liberty. Civil government, he argues, concerns property and peace. Religion concerns salvation. The two must not interfere with each other. When magistrates claim power over belief, they exceed their jurisdiction. When priests claim power over civil law, they endanger society. Toleration, then, is not merely a political compromise, but a moral necessity. It allows reason and faith to coexist without domination. In Locke's world, truth advances not by persecution, but by persuasion. The legacy of Locke's toleration reaches far beyond his time. His ideas inspired not only the Enlightenment's calls for freedom of conscience, but also the constitutional protections of modern democracies. The American founders, in particular, found in Locke a philosophical architect of liberty. Jefferson's declaration that all men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights, is a direct echo of Locke's principles. The very notion that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed descends from Locke's political philosophy. His words, written in the turbulence of the 17th century, became the moral compass of the 18th and 19th. Yet Locke's legacy is not without contradiction. His defense of property, though framed in moral terms, would later be used to justify colonial expansion and economic inequality. His toleration, though progressive, excluded certain groups. His empiricism, though liberating, contained the seeds of materialism that would challenge the very moral foundations he sought to uphold. Still, these tensions testify not to failure, but to depth. Locke's philosophy is not a closed system, but a living argument, one that continues to evolve in dialogue with its own consequences. At its core, Locke's thought embodies a faith in the possibility of progress. If knowledge is born from experience, then human understanding can expand indefinitely. If power arises from consent, then justice can be reformed. If virtue can be taught, then society can improve. This optimism defines the Enlightenment's moral horizon. The world is not fixed by fate, but open to reason. In Locke's hands, philosophy becomes an instrument of emancipation, the art of freeing both the mind and the commonwealth. Locke's political philosophy reaches beyond his era, resonating through every generation that questions the nature of freedom, authority, and legitimacy. In his vision, the social contract is not a historical event, but a continuous act of moral reasoning. Every citizen, by obeying the law, reaffirms the collective decision to live under reason rather than power. Every law, by serving the common good, reaffirms its legitimacy through justice. In this sense, the state is never a finished structure, but an ongoing argument between liberty and necessity. This dynamic and moral vision transforms politics into an ethical art, a form of reason applied to collective life.
Locke's insistence on natural rights, life, liberty, and property anchors his philosophy in a profound respect for the individual. These rights are not granted by government, they precede it. They are the conditions of personhood, the moral grammar of human existence. To violate them is to deny the humanity of others. Locke thus builds a bridge between metaphysics and ethics, the idea that every person, as a rational being, bears intrinsic worth. This simple yet revolutionary idea becomes the seed of human rights, equality before law, and democratic self-rule. It is no exaggeration to say that Locke's pen drafted the moral architecture of the modern world. Yet Locke is not naive about the fragility of this architecture. Freedom, he warns, is not self-sustaining. It requires vigilance, education, and virtue. A people untrained in reason becomes prey to demagogues. A government unbound by law becomes a tyranny in disguise. The remedy lies not in more power, but in more understanding. For Locke, the true foundation of liberty is the moral and intellectual maturity of citizens. Without that, constitutions are parchment, rights are words, and laws are fragile fences against corruption. His reflections on consent introduce the subtle moral psychology. Consent is not mere agreement, it is recognition. When a citizen consents to government, they acknowledge that their own will is bound by the will of the community. This act of recognition transforms obedience into participation. In obeying just laws, the individual is not dominated, but self-governed, for the law expresses the rational will of all. This unity between freedom and obedience dissolves the false dichotomy between individual and society. In Locke's thought, to live in a lawful community is to live as a rational being among equals. Locke's views on punishment and justice flow naturally from this moral structure. Punishment for him is not vengeance, but restoration. It restores the moral balance disrupted by wrongdoing. The wrongdoer, by violating another's rights, declares a temporary war on reason itself. Justice reasserts reason's dominion. Thus, even coercion serves a moral purpose when bounded by law. The rule of law is not the rule of force, but the rule of justified force, power tamed by principle. This distinction would later influence modern theories of justice, from Kant to Rawls, grounding authority in rational legitimacy rather than fear. In his reflections on the human mind, Locke continues this moral rationalism. The mind, though a blank slate at birth, is not a chaos of sensations. It possesses the power to reflect, to compare, to abstract. From these powers arises the very structure of thought, perception, reasoning, and moral judgment. This active dimension of the mind refutes both determinism and fatalism. Human beings are not passive receivers of impressions, but active interpreters of experience. In that interpretive power lies moral responsibility. Each person, through reflection, becomes accountable for their beliefs, their choices, and their conduct. Locke's theory of personal identity extends this accountability into the metaphysical realm. Identity, he argues, is founded not in substance, but in consciousness. The self persists through memory, not through matter. To remember one's actions is to remain the same person who performed them. This notion of identity transforms morality into self-knowledge. It is through the continuous awareness of one's past that one becomes a moral agent. Forgetfulness, in this sense, is not merely cognitive, but ethical, a loss of responsibility, a fragmentation of the self. This theory anticipates modern debates about the relationship between memory, identity, and moral continuity. Locke's ethics, though secular in tone, retain a quiet reverence for divine order. He believes that reason and morality are reflections of God's rational will. The natural law is divine reason written into the fabric of creation. Thus, to live by reason is to live in harmony with the divine. But Locke's God is not a despot. He is a legislator of reason, not of mystery. Faith, therefore, is not blind submission, but rational trust. It complements reason by anchoring it in moral purpose. This reconciliation of faith and reason allows Locke to avoid both atheistic skepticism and fanatic orthodoxy, establishing a middle ground where philosophy and religion coexist without tyranny. Locke's understanding of social progress also emerges from this moral theology. He envisions history as the gradual unfolding of reason within society. Each generation inherits not only material wealth, but moral insight. Science, law, and education are the instruments of this unfolding. They extend the boundaries of human freedom by extending understanding. Thus, progress is not guaranteed, but possible, a reward for intellectual virtue and moral effort. The Enlightenment, in this view, is not a rebellion against faith, but its rational fulfillment.
Locke's influence on political economy cannot be ignored. He redefines wealth not as hoarded gold, but as the product of labor and invention. Economic value arises from human creativity applied to nature. This principle would later inspire the liberal faith in productivity, innovation, and trade. Yet Locke tempers this optimism with ethical restraint. The accumulation of wealth, he insists, is just only when it respects the rights of others. He condemns waste as moral corruption, a violation of the divine order of stewardship. To own is to be responsible. To labor is to participate in creation. This moral dimension elevates his economics from calculation to conscience. In the field of epistemology, Locke's influence shapes the scientific method itself. By grounding knowledge in observation and experiment, he provides the intellectual scaffolding for modern empiricism. The sciences, liberated from dogma, now operate under the same modesty Locke demanded of philosophy. Test, verify, revise. Truth becomes a process rather than a possession. This methodological humility paradoxically fuels the explosion of knowledge in the centuries that follow. Locke's epistemology thus becomes not only a theory of mind, but a charter of inquiry, a philosophy of discovery. Locke's emphasis on communication as the medium of understanding is also profound. Words, he argues, are signs of ideas, not of things. Miscommunication arises when words lose their connection to experience. This diagnosis remains strikingly modern. In an age of rhetoric and propaganda, Locke's warning rings true. Language, untethered from reality, becomes an instrument of confusion and domination. His remedy is philosophical clarity, the careful use of terms, the discipline of defining before judging. For Locke, the purification of language is the purification of thought. In his later writings, Locke turns to the theme of happiness, uniting ethics and psychology. True happiness, he maintains, lies not in transient pleasure, but in the calm of rational satisfaction. The pursuit of happiness is not hedonism, but the disciplined alignment of desire with reason. This idea, quietly revolutionary, would later become enshrined in political doctrine, the right to pursue happiness as a civic virtue. To seek rational joy, Locke implies, is to fulfill the purpose of human nature. Freedom without happiness is incomplete. Happiness without reason is fleeting.
Philosophy thus becomes the art of living well, not merely of thinking rightly. Locke's legacy endures because he offers both humility and hope. He teaches that the mind is limited but powerful, the world uncertain but knowable, the individual frail but dignified. He replaces the arrogance of dogma with the discipline of inquiry. He replaces the tyranny of power with the authority of reason. His philosophy is not a monument, but a mirror. It reflects the rational potential of humanity. In Locke's universe, knowledge is freedom, and freedom is the highest form of moral order. Locke's final contributions to the philosophical world transcend his own century, forming the invisible foundation beneath nearly every modern institution, from democratic government to liberal education. His insistence on reason as the common measure of truth laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment's intellectual courage. The belief that ordinary minds, unaided by priests or princes, could discover the order of the world. Yet Locke was not a radical in the spirit of destruction. He was a radical in the spirit of construction. He sought not to overturn society, but to anchor it in the dignity of rational individuals. For him, enlightenment was not rebellion, but awakening. The universality of his moral vision emerges most clearly in his reflections on toleration. In a world torn by sectarian conflict, Locke proposed something unprecedented: the separation of spiritual authority from civil power. He declared that the care of souls belongs to faith, not to force, and that belief imposed by law is not belief at all. True religion, he said, resides in the sincerity of conscience, not in conformity. By defending this moral autonomy, Locke transformed religious freedom from a theological privilege into a human right. The Church became a voluntary society of believers, the state a guardian of peace among them. The harmony between these two realms, conscience and community, became a defining aspiration of modern civilization. Locke's letter concerning toleration was not merely political advice. It was a manifesto for spiritual maturity. He understood that coercion in matters of belief poisons both religion and government. Faith without freedom is hypocrisy. Government without tolerance is tyranny. The only stable foundation for social order is mutual respect among rational beings. In that simple claim lies the moral architecture of pluralism, the invisible ethic that allows diverse societies to coexist without tearing themselves apart.
His emphasis on education extended this ethic into the personal realm. Locke viewed education as the art of forming character through reason. The human mind, like a field, must be cultivated with care and patience. Knowledge without virtue, he warned, becomes vanity. Virtue without understanding becomes superstition. Thus, the aim of education is neither to stuff the mind with facts, nor to mold the will through fear, but to awaken the power of judgment. This power, the ability to think freely and act justly, is what makes one truly human. Locke's reflections on education anticipate the liberal arts tradition and the modern university. He argued that curiosity, not authority, should guide learning. The child, he believed, learns through experience and reflection, not through rote repetition. Moral instruction, too, must appeal to reason, not punishment. Virtue learned through fear disappears when the fear is gone. Virtue learned through reason endures because it becomes part of the self. For Locke, education is not preparation for life, it is life itself, the ongoing exercise of freedom in thought. His view of progress remains grounded in modesty. Unlike later thinkers who imagined history as an inevitable ascent toward perfection,
Locke saw progress as conditional and fragile. Reason may expand knowledge, but passion can still corrupt it. Civilization, he knew, rests on moral self-restraint as much as on scientific discovery. Without virtue, knowledge becomes manipulation. Without justice, liberty becomes license. The true measure of a society for Locke is the harmony it achieves between reason and will, freedom and order. This balance, always precarious, must be renewed by every generation. Locke's political and moral ideas converged in his belief that government is a moral trust, not a metaphysical necessity. The rulers are trustees of the people's rights, not their owners. Power derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that consent is not perpetual but revocable. When government betrays its trust, citizens have not only the right but the duty to resist. This doctrine, revolutionary in its time, later inspired revolutions across continents, from the American colonies to Europe and beyond. Yet Locke's revolution was intellectual before it was political. He armed humanity not with swords, but with arguments. The resonance of Locke's ideas with the founders of modern democracy is unmistakable. Jefferson's declaration that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights echoes Locke's formula almost word for word. But where politics adopted his principles, philosophy continued to wrestle with his implications. If knowledge arises from experience, what guarantees the stability of truth? If the mind is a blank slate, what anchors morality in more than preference? These questions gave rise to the great philosophical debates of the 18th and 19th centuries. From Kant's critique of empiricism to Mill's liberal utilitarianism. In every case, Locke stands at the beginning, the quiet architect of inquiry. Yet his own writings contain paradoxes he never resolved. The same Locke who defended equality tolerated slavery under certain colonial laws. The same man who championed liberty excluded atheists from his vision of toleration. These contradictions reveal not hypocrisy, but the tension between principle and history. Locke was a philosopher of the possible, a man who expanded the circle of moral concern as far as his age allowed. The task of later generations would be to carry his logic further, until reason and humanity became truly universal. In his epistemology, Locke's most enduring contribution is humility. By rejecting innate ideas and divine certainties, he replaced arrogance with inquiry. Knowledge, he said, is not revelation, but relationship, the measured correspondence between ideas and experience. To know something is not to possess its essence, but to understand its effects. This modest definition freed science from metaphysics and allowed it to flourish on the solid ground of observation. Yet Locke's humility was not skepticism. He believed that human reason, though limited, is sufficient for morality and progress. We cannot know everything, but we can know enough to live wisely and justly. Locke's reflections on property complete the circle of his moral system. Property is not greed sanctified, but labor dignified. It arises when human effort transforms nature into something personal. The apple picked, the field plowed, the tool forged, these become extensions of one's will, expressions of freedom in the physical world. Property thus becomes the link between the self and society, a moral claim that recognizes both autonomy and responsibility. But Locke insists that this right is bounded by the principle of sufficiency. One may take from nature only so much as one can use without waste, and only so long as enough remains for others. This ethical restraint distinguishes liberty from exploitation.
As he moved toward the end of his career, Locke's tone became more reflective, even pastoral. He no longer sought to reform only governments and institutions, but the very consciousness of humanity. The liberation he envisioned was inward, a freedom of the mind from fear, prejudice, and superstition. To think clearly is to live freely. Every act of understanding, every honest doubt becomes an act of emancipation. Thus, philosophy itself becomes a moral duty, a daily practice of mental integrity. Locke's death in 1704 marked not the end of his philosophy, but its dispersal into the bloodstream of civilization. His ideas survived because they were not built on dogma, but on experience, not on revelation, but on reason. They adapted to new contexts without losing their essence. Wherever human beings claim the right to think, to speak, to choose, or to believe, Locke's spirit endures. His influence is not visible like a monument. It is living like light, diffused through the mind of every free individual. Even in the modern age, when technology and power threaten to eclipse wisdom, Locke's calm rationalism remains a guide. He reminds us that progress is not measured by machines or markets, but by the moral growth of individuals. True advancement is the widening of understanding, the tempering of desire, the cultivation of conscience. Freedom without self-knowledge becomes chaos. Knowledge without humility becomes tyranny. The equilibrium between them, that quiet middle ground of reason, is the heart of Locke's philosophy. In the end, Locke's thought offers a faith without fanaticism, a reason without pride, and a freedom without anarchy. He believed that humanity's dignity lies not in perfection, but in perseverance, the steady effort to think clearly, act justly, and live peacefully. His philosophy is less a system than a method. Observe carefully, judge fairly, and never claim more certainty than experience allows. In that modest method lies the moral grandeur of enlightenment. Locke's voice continues to echo through time, not as a shout, but as a steady whisper. Trust reason, respect others, and let no power silence the conscience of the mind. Locke's thought, while born in the turbulence of the 17th century England, gradually became a language that transcended borders. It shaped the revolutions of thought that followed, the American, the French, and the liberal awakenings that sought to rebuild society on rational foundations. His insistence that knowledge comes from experience provided a method for science, but it also offered a moral outlook. Trust what you can see, test what you can claim, and never elevate opinion to dogma. This habit of inquiry turned into the common sense of the modern world. When a citizen questions a law, when a scientist demands evidence, when a teacher invites a child to think rather than memorize, Locke is speaking through them. At the heart of this influence lies his confidence in the ordinary mind. He refused to accept that wisdom was the property of scholars or priests. The capacity for reason, he said, is distributed widely, and the purpose of education and society is to awaken it, not to restrain it. The dignity of humanity is therefore not in what we possess, but in what we can understand. This conviction turned philosophy from a private speculation into a public project. It made freedom of thought the first duty of citizenship. In Locke's moral writings, a delicate optimism threads through every argument. Human beings are not born corrupt, nor are they born virtuous. They are born capable. the potential for moral growth lies within experience and reflection. Evil arises not from nature, but from neglect, from the failure to think, to learn, to consider others. Thus, moral reform begins with intellectual reform. The improvement of the mind becomes the purification of the soul. When people understand the causes of their actions, they can change them. When they understand the rights of others, they can respect them. This harmony between knowledge and virtue defines Locke's humanism. He never abandoned the belief that reason, though limited, could guide humanity toward justice. Even when he recognized the power of passion, he treated emotion as something to be educated, not suppressed. Desire, channeled by understanding, becomes aspiration. Anger, disciplined by reflection, becomes courage. The moral life is not the denial of feeling, but its refinement through judgment. In this, Locke's philosophy anticipates the modern idea of emotional intelligence, the art of uniting clarity and compassion. His reflections on governance also contain a quiet warning that resonates today. Institutions, he observed, are mirrors of the minds that create them. A corrupt people cannot sustain a virtuous government. An ignorant people cannot maintain a free one. Laws may restrain tyranny for a time, but only education prevents its return. Liberty, therefore, depends less on constitutions than on character. This insight transforms politics into a moral discipline. To preserve freedom is to cultivate reason, tolerance, and self-restraint in every citizen.
Locke's reflections on commerce illustrate another side of his realism. Trade, he said, is not merely the exchange of goods, but the expression of mutual dependence. Markets succeed when trust prevails. They collapse when greed overwhelms honesty. Economic freedom, therefore, is inseparable from moral freedom. The invisible hand of prosperity functions only where conscience is awake. In this sense, Locke's liberalism is not purely economic, but ethical. It is a call for responsibility in the midst of abundance, moderation in the pursuit of gain, and gratitude for the natural order that sustains life. When Locke considered history, he saw not a linear march, but a slow education of humanity. Each generation inherits not only knowledge, but the duty to examine it. Progress occurs when experience corrects error, when reason replaces superstition, and when laws replace violence. Yet this process, he warned, can reverse if arrogance outpaces understanding. Civilizations fall when they confuse wealth with wisdom, power with justice, and freedom with indulgence. The cure always is a return to inquiry, to the modest, disciplined search for truth that defines the rational spirit. Locke's style of thinking, cautious, lucid, empirical, became a model for all who feared the excesses of ideology. He distrusted systems that claimed total knowledge. Philosophy, he said, should illuminate, not dictate. The wise thinker draws boundaries around his certainty and respects the mystery that remains beyond them. This intellectual humility, far from weakness, is the condition of peace. It prevents the fanaticism that turns conviction into cruelty. A world guided by Locke's moderation would not be utopian, but it would be sane. His discussion of civil society also contains a profound anthropology. People, he believed, are not isolated atoms, but naturally sociable. The state of nature is not a battlefield, but a beginning, a condition where moral law already whispers in the conscience. Government arises not to crush instincts, but to coordinate them. Community is the extension of reason into collective life. The same rational faculty that allows a person to keep a promise enables a nation to form a constitution. Thus, political order mirrors the moral order of the mind.
Locke's insistence on natural rights also transforms the notion of equality. Equality for him is not uniformity, but mutual recognition. To acknowledge another as equal is to acknowledge them as capable of reason and deserving of respect. This moral equality underlies all legitimate authority. A ruler is not superior by nature, but by trust, and that trust must always serve the good of the governed. When power forgets this, equality reasserts itself through resistance. The revolutions inspired by Locke's logic are in essence acts of remembrance, the restoration of dignity to the governed. The religious dimension of Locke's thought remains subtle but essential. He saw in reason the reflection of divine order, and in morality the expression of divine will. Yet he insisted that God's law operates through the same rational principles accessible to all. Revelation, if genuine, cannot contradict reason, for both spring from the same source. In this harmony between faith and intellect, Locke found peace. He rescued religion from the tyranny of dogma and philosophy from the despair of atheism. For him, to think clearly was already a form of worship. Even his reflections on death are serene. The fear of mortality, he suggested, arises from ignorance, not from the nature of death itself. To understand life as a chain of perceptions is to see death as a transition, not an annihilation. The self that persists through memory and reflection has already touched the eternal, for consciousness belongs to the order of thought, not to the decay of matter. To live rationally, therefore, is to die peacefully. In reason, one finds not only truth, but consolation. As Locke's ideas spread, they mingled with the political ambitions of nations and the spiritual hopes of individuals. Some used them to justify revolution, others to defend reform. Yet the power of his philosophy lies not in any particular policy, but in its method. Begin with experience, respect reason, and test every claim against reality. This triad, experience, reason, reality, remains the charter of free minds. Wherever people debate without violence, learn without fear, and govern without despotism, Locke's method endures. Even today, when knowledge accelerates beyond comprehension and technology outpaces wisdom, Locke's restraint feels prophetic. He reminds us that progress without virtue is peril, and liberty without discipline is chaos. The same empirical spirit that unlocked nature's secrets must now be turned inward, to the study of human motives and morals. We have conquered the physical world, but we have yet to govern ourselves with equal precision. In this unfinished task, Locke's calm rationalism remains a compass.
He taught that humility is the beginning of wisdom, and that wisdom is the foundation of peace. His legacy, therefore, is not only political or scientific, but spiritual. The faith that truth is attainable through patience, dialogue, and mutual respect. This faith, fragile yet enduring, holds civilization together more firmly than any army or empire. It is the invisible contract that unites minds across centuries, the promise that reason, if honored, will keep humanity free. Locke's philosophy also extended into the realm of education, where he envisioned a process that molds both the intellect and the character. He argued that the mind is not filled by force, but formed by experience and gentle cultivation. The child is not a vessel to be crammed with dogma, but a seed that grows through guidance, reason, and habit. For Locke, education was the most powerful tool to shape citizens capable of self-government, rational, disciplined, and tolerant. The teacher's task was not to impose fear or obedience, but to cultivate autonomy and moral sense. He emphasized that virtue, not rote learning, was the true foundation of wisdom. A society of clever minds without moral grounding, he warned, is doomed to corruption. Thus, education must teach restraint, self-control, and empathy alongside knowledge. His vision prefigured the Enlightenment's belief that through reason and proper guidance, humanity could improve itself collectively. Locke also transformed the concept of freedom from an abstract idea into a lived social principle. To him, freedom did not mean doing whatever one wished. It meant being governed by laws that one had a rational role in creating. This vision became the moral heartbeat of liberal democracy. The governed are not slaves to authority, but partners in the social order, and every law must answer to the consent of the people. His understanding of power as trust, a moral relationship rather than divine right, became revolutionary. Governments that betray that trust lose their legitimacy. This notion shaped the modern world, echoed later in Jefferson's declaration that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Locke planted the intellectual seed that would grow into revolutions. He also recognized that property, liberty, and life were inseparable. If any one of these were threatened, the others would crumble. Ownership gave individuals independence. Independence gave them freedom. Freedom gave them dignity. But he cautioned that property should not become an idol. It was justified only when it served the well-being of all. Accumulation without moral restraint, he implied, would distort society and degrade character. In the moral sphere, Locke rejected innate sin or preordained virtue. People are born neither good nor evil, but capable of both, shaped by experience and choice. This belief placed immense faith in human potential, the idea that with reason and proper institutions, humanity could rise above ignorance and tyranny. It was an optimism grounded not in fantasy, but in discipline and understanding. Locke's theory of knowledge continued to evolve as he contemplated the limits of certainty. He realized that while the senses give us impressions, the mind interprets and organizes them. Absolute certainty, he admitted, belongs only to mathematics and logic. In all other fields, we operate with degrees of probability. This humility toward knowledge became a cornerstone of scientific thinking. It taught thinkers to weigh evidence, question assumptions, and remain open to revision. His insistence on toleration was not mere politeness, it was a philosophical necessity. If knowledge comes from experience, and experience differs for everyone, then coercion in matters of belief is irrational. Faith forced by violence is not faith, but fear. Locke envisioned a society where diverse beliefs coexist peacefully under the protection of law, united not by dogma, but by respect for reason. This tolerance, however, was not limitless. He argued that those who seek to destroy the social contract through fanaticism, despotism, or cruelty forfeit the right to its protection. Liberty must defend itself from those who would extinguish it. Thus, his liberalism was not naive. It was guarded, pragmatic, and aware of human frailty. As Locke aged, his ideas became a moral system as much as a political one. He saw reason as the true revelation, not an enemy of faith, but its companion. Where Scripture speaks to the Spirit, reason secures justice in the world of men. And in this harmony between faith and logic, he glimpsed the possibility of peace, not through uniformity, but through understanding.
Locke's later writings delved deeper into the moral and psychological fabric of human nature. He viewed human beings as creatures capable of improvement through discipline and reflection. Vice, in his view, was not a permanent stain, but a failure of education and self-control. The moral life was not given by divine decree alone, but cultivated through awareness of one's duties, moderation of one's passions, and the constant exercise of judgment. This belief in gradual moral development linked his political and epistemological theories. Both relied on the slow accumulation of understanding, experience, and reflection. For Locke, freedom and responsibility were inseparable. To act freely meant to act rationally, to deliberate between options, and to follow the choice that reason deems most just. In his essay concerning human understanding, he defined liberty not as the absence of restraint, but as the capacity to act according to one's will within the bounds of law and conscience. Freedom was never chaos, it was self-mastery. A society of free people, then, required citizens who could rule themselves before ruling others. He observed that the greatest danger to liberty was not external tyranny, but internal ignorance. People who fail to cultivate reason become slaves to superstition, manipulation, and appetite. Thus, the preservation of liberty depends on education, discourse, and the defense of truth against the corrosive effects of blind belief. Locke's emphasis on reason as the foundation of political order reflected his faith in human capacity for improvement, but also his recognition of its fragility. Locke's notion of property continued to evolve beyond economics into a philosophy of self. He argued that ownership begins with ownership of one's body and labor. When a person mixes labor with nature, cultivating soil, crafting tools, or creating art, they extend themselves into the world. Property becomes an expression of personal identity. But this act must always be bounded by justice. Enough and as good must remain for others. This principle reflects Locke's moral realism, the belief that rights exist only within a balance of fairness and communal obligation. In Locke's world, political power existed to protect that balance. The ruler's authority was not a right of command, but a trust for service. Once that trust was broken through tyranny, corruption, or violation of natural rights, the people regained their moral right to resist and rebuild. This was the intellectual seed of modern constitutionalism, the foundation upon which democratic societies still stand. The government is not a master, but a guardian, and its legitimacy flows upward from the consent of the governed. He also believed that the greatest revolutions begin not in violence, but in thought. The mind liberated from dogma becomes a force of transformation. By questioning inherited authority, Locke equipped generations to build societies based on reason rather than superstition. The Enlightenment's call for reform, toleration, and progress owed much to this quiet revolution in the understanding of the human mind. Yet Locke was no idealist detached from reality. He understood that societies must balance freedom with stability, passion with prudence. His defense of gradual reform rather than radical upheaval revealed a cautious optimism, a belief that reason can guide change without chaos. He valued peace as the natural companion of liberty and saw justice not as vengeance, but as proportionate correction rooted in law. In the moral sphere, Locke examined conscience as the inner tribunal of human action. It was not infallible, but it was the best guide available, sharpened by reflection and education. Through the dialogue between reason and experience, conscience grows in clarity, aligning individual will with universal moral law. In this sense, morality was not a list of commandments, but an evolving understanding of human good discovered through living and learning. He viewed religion through this same lens of rational humility. True faith, Locke wrote, could never be imposed. It must be embraced by a free mind. God endowed man with reason not to replace faith, but to safeguard it from corruption. When priests or kings claim absolute authority over the conscience of others, they turn divine truth into tyranny. Locke's vision of a tolerant faith was thus both spiritual and political. It freed the soul and preserved civil harmony. In the end, Locke's philosophy offered a comprehensive vision of human dignity. Knowledge, morality, and politics were not separate realms, but interwoven aspects of the same pursuit to understand and improve the human condition. He believed that every mind, no matter how humble, carried the potential for wisdom, and in that potential lay the foundation of equality, progress, and hope. For Locke, enlightenment was not a grand event, but a quiet, daily act. The willingness to think, to question, to act justly, and to live by reason.
Locke's influence on the modern world extends far beyond the boundaries of his own time, because his ideas created a framework for how human beings understand themselves as moral and political agents. He believed that the true measure of civilization was not wealth or conquest, but the capacity to reason together under laws of mutual respect. His philosophy offered a balance between freedom and order, individuality and community, knowledge and humility, a delicate harmony that would come to define liberal thought. In his reflections on human understanding, Locke proposed that all ideas stem from experience, but he went further to argue that understanding itself is an active process. The mind is not a mirror simply reflecting the world. It is a craftsman that shapes perceptions, compares impressions, and constructs meaning. Through this process, human beings become capable of science, art, and moral law. For Locke, the pursuit of knowledge was not a luxury, but a duty, the means by which humanity continually frees itself from ignorance. His theory of perception was revolutionary because it replaced metaphysical speculation with empirical observation. The distinction between primary and secondary qualities, between the objective features of reality, shape, motion, number, and the subjective experiences, color, taste, sound, set the foundation for modern science and psychology alike. It showed that while our sensations may deceive us, reason and careful analysis can still uncover reliable truths about the natural world. Locke's political philosophy, however, remains his most enduring legacy. He taught that the legitimacy of any government depends on its respect for natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and its accountability to the people it governs. His argument dismantled centuries of divine right monarchy, asserting instead that authority is always conditional. No ruler can claim obedience without justice. In Locke's moral universe, power exists only to secure freedom, not to extinguish it. He believed that the social contract binds rulers and citizens alike in a moral relationship based on trust. This idea transformed politics from the realm of force into the realm of ethics. The true state is not an instrument of domination, but an agreement to protect mutual rights and ensure peace. If it fails in that duty, rebellion becomes not a sin, but a form of restoration, the people reclaiming their original freedom. Locke's reflections on labor, property, and wealth continued to challenge later generations. He argued that property originates in human effort. It is the extension of one's will into the material world. By cultivating land or producing goods, a person makes nature serve human flourishing. Yet this right is not absolute. When accumulation deprives others of their share in the common bounty, property ceases to be just. The moral limit to possession is sufficiency and fairness, not greed. His thoughts on tolerance were equally bold for his era. In a time of religious wars and persecution, Locke proclaimed that faith must be free or it is meaningless. The conscience is sacred ground. It cannot be coerced by the sword or the edict. In his Letter Concerning Toleration, he envisioned a society where differing beliefs coexist under a common civil framework, guided by reason and law. He recognized that diversity of opinion is not a threat to truth, but its natural companion, for only in freedom can truth be tested and strengthened. Locke's belief in progress was cautious but unwavering. He saw humanity not as fallen or perfect, but as capable of improvement through reasoned effort. The moral advancement of society depended on education, fairness, and the spread of knowledge. Tyranny thrives on ignorance, he warned, but enlightenment grows from the patient cultivation of thought. His optimism was tempered by realism. He knew that passion and prejudice often overpower reason, but he also trusted that the human spirit, once awakened, would not easily return to darkness. He also explored the psychology of identity, which is one of his most original contributions to philosophy. In defining the self as the continuity of consciousness, memory, and reflection over time, Locke detached personhood from the mere substance of the body. The self was not a static essence, but an ongoing narrative shaped by awareness. This insight would later influence debates about personal responsibility, ethics, and even artificial intelligence. To be a person, in Locke's sense, was to be capable of moral accountability, to remember, to intend, to choose. In this way, Locke placed moral and political liberty upon the same foundation, the sovereignty of consciousness. Just as no one can think or believe for another, no one can rule justly without consent. The inner freedom of the mind and the external freedom of the citizen mirror one another. Both depend on respect for the autonomy of reason.
Locke's mature thought reveals a philosopher deeply aware of the tension between human limitation and human potential. He did not imagine that reason could solve every problem, or that freedom would always prevail, but he believed that through deliberate thought and cooperation, mankind could slowly refine its institutions toward justice. Progress for Locke was not a sudden revolution of nature, but the steady triumph of reason over error, generation by generation. He also stressed the importance of moderation in all things. Extremes, whether of belief, wealth, or power, destroy the delicate equilibrium upon which peace rests. Virtue lies in temperance, the ability to balance passion with judgment, ambition with humility. This moderation was not weakness, but wisdom, for Locke understood that enduring societies are built not by zealots, but by reasonable people willing to compromise for the common good. In the end, Locke's philosophy presents a profound faith in humanity's moral capacity. He saw no need for miracles or mysteries to explain virtue. It arises naturally from reason and empathy when properly cultivated. His entire system is a testament to trust in the senses, in the mind, and in the possibility of a just society governed by understanding. He believed that truth may be slow to reveal itself, but through honest inquiry and mutual respect, it always will. Locke gave the modern world its moral architecture, a framework where freedom, reason, and conscience are not privileges, but conditions of human existence. His words remain an antidote to fanaticism and despair, a reminder that the path to justice lies not in domination, but in dialogue, and that enlightenment is not a single act, but an endless conversation between the mind and the world. Locke's legacy, when viewed from the distance of centuries, is not merely that of a philosopher, but of a founder of an intellectual civilization. He gave shape to a world where knowledge grows through evidence, authority bends before reason, and power answers to conscience. His thought was revolutionary because it armed ordinary people with a new understanding of their own dignity. The right to think freely, to govern oneself, to question, to own, to believe. These were no longer privileges granted by rulers, but natural conditions of being human. In his later reflections, Locke warned that liberty, once won, must be constantly renewed.
Freedom, he wrote, is not a possession, but a responsibility. It dies not from sudden conquest, but from neglect, from the slow decay of vigilance, reason, and moral courage. He saw that the same faculties that liberate the human mind can also enslave it when corrupted by greed, superstition, or fear. Thus, his philosophy was not only a defense of rights, but a call to character, to use freedom wisely, to temper power with justice, and to ground ambition in virtue. He understood that the greatest revolutions begin within, in the quiet act of a mind refusing to accept dogma without proof. Every discovery, every reform, every moral awakening begins with that inward rebellion of thought. Locke's faith in education and reason was not naive optimism. It was an unshakable belief that humanity, if taught to think clearly, could learn to live rightly. For him, ignorance was the root of tyranny, and enlightenment its cure. He saw government as an instrument of peace, not domination, a covenant that exists only to secure the natural harmony between individuals. Its failure begins when rulers forget they are servants and when citizens forget they are responsible. Power must always answer to reason, and reason must always answer to conscience. That was Locke's eternal equilibrium, law and liberty, balanced by morality. Locke's philosophy ends not in abstraction, but in a practical vision of humanity's place in the world. Each person, he believed, is born with the capacity for truth and the duty to seek it. The mind begins as an empty canvas, but what it becomes, through education, reflection, and experience, determines the moral and political destiny of humankind. Freedom is not chaos, but creation, not an escape from law, but the highest expression of it when guided by reason. And so Locke's ultimate lesson is that progress depends not on miracles or monarchs, but on the courage of individuals to think and act justly. He taught that truth belongs to no single authority, that peace is the natural child of tolerance, and that knowledge is the greatest safeguard of liberty. His voice still echoes wherever people question tyranny, defend reason, and build societies rooted in justice rather than fear. In the end, John Locke did not offer humanity a finished system, but a moral compass. His philosophy invites each generation to rediscover the same principles in new circumstances, to test, to question, and to improve. He believed that wisdom is not inherited, but earned, and that the greatest act of faith is to trust in human reason.